Welcome to the Escape News Podcast. I'm your host, Chad.
And I'm Ryan.
And today we are talking about nuclear, and not just nuclear bombs, which definitely in this research we've gotten into a little bit more than I wanted to, But we're going to be talking about nuclear reactors and power particularly. So I'll be covering some of the incidents that have happened, particularly Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, which everybody is probably aware of. I'm sure you're taught this in schools or you've heard it in the news. And then Ryan will cover more of the next gen, what we're going to be doing in the future as far as nuclear power, what we'd like to be doing unless we blow ourselves up. But hey, first thing to say is nuclear reactors don't blow up like bombs. Like, they don't have the same materials in it. So we got to get that myth out of the way that everybody's afraid,
Yeah.
We're going to have a nuclear detonation in our backyard. It doesn't work that way. Different explosion, completely different materials, not the same type of fallout. So we're going to go into a little bit just how reactors work first before we get into the history of the incidents and conspiracy theories or whatever. So all reactors, how we generate power as far as like coal and nuclear and gas and things like that. You heat up water, you create steam, it spins a turbine, creates electricity. That's the gist there with power generation. Obviously, you go into other stuff like solar, and you're generating power in a different way. I guess wind is the same, like, right? It's just like wind is spinning a turbine. So yeah, as long as the turbine spins, we make power. So a nuclear reactor, though, it's a little bit different because you have nuclear processes going, like atomic, like fission and stuff. So I'm just going to read a little bit of the information that I have here. A nuclear reactor, a device designed to release under controlled circumstances the energy stored in the nucleus of an atom. Although engineers talk of burning nuclear fuel, the process is fundamentally different than the chemical process of combustion, like coal or gas. In combustion, the atoms or molecules of the fuel, coal, oil, or wood, are joined to molecules of oxygen in a process that releases heat. In a nuclear reaction, the fuel atoms split themselves are split into smaller atoms in a process called fission. So I'm just going to summarize here. You have in nuclear reactions fission, so they break apart and then all the neutrons break and hit other cells and break more. And so you have this just repeating compounding process of little neutrons hitting other atoms and knocking more neutrons off to create heat, basically, to heat up water. Once heat is generated, the process of converting into electricity is identical, like we said, to all the other stuff. You just turn a turbine with steam. So now when we're talking about Russia, or not Russia, well, I mean, it was Russia at the time, Ukraine and Chernobyl, that reactor is RBMK, which is different than the U.S. Boiling water reactors or light water reactor, or like Fukushima. Those are different types of plants, but it's the same fundamental process. Also, side note, for those who have seen nuclear power plants, the big, tall concrete tower with the water running down is not the reactor. That is the common misconception. It's the little building next door. Like, it's a tiny little building. And in like Japan's case, they didn't have those big, tall towers. They had it in a much smaller scale. Different process, but like 3 Mile Island, the big notable reactor towers, those are just cooling towers. The water runs down the side, cools off. And so I'm going to put a picture on screen that shows so this is TMI2. This is reactor, or 3 Mile Island, the reactor building 2, and its cooling tower, and how the process works. So you have the water, you have two separate systems of water. You have the water that's around the reactor core heating up, and then you have like all these steam generators and pressurizers and different stuff going on. And then you have a separate water that gets flowed in past the other water and runs down to the like cooling system. They keep everything separate. Also, like, an important thing to know about the Chernobyl reactor is that they do not have a containment vessel, whereas our reactors did. They have containment vessels around the actual like reactor cores to, separate radiation and dangerous things from the outside world. So now we're on to 3 Mile Island. I'm going to try to go through these pretty quickly because the fundamentals of what happened is pretty similar. Fukushima had a different set of circumstances because they had an earthquake and a tsunami, and that changes things. But 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl are similar as far as they had steam buildups and stuff like that. Obviously, at Chernobyl, they have some explosions. But 3 Mile Island, so this is March 28th, 1979, 4 a.m. is roughly when the incident started. And what was happening here is they had a clog. So the reactor itself automatically shut down. So they had shot some airflow into the piping to unblock the clog that was in there. And that like sent the computer off to think that some of the air particles were dangerous. So basically the computer took over the reactor to prevent anything from happening that would be dangerous. It started its own shutdown procedures. And had they left everything alone, it would have done its job. Like it would have been mostly fine from what I understand. Like there's some speculation about like exactly what would happen, but the computer would have handled a lot of things. And what happened is one of the valves that releases the pressure buildup got stuck open. So it was just releasing all this radioactive mist water up into its own containment chamber, and it was building up on the floor. So they had all these notices in the control room, but they had like hundreds of lights. And on any given day in 3 Mile Island, you would have had tons of lights on the walls. And their computer that was sending out information to the printer was at like such a slow speed. By the time they would get information from the computer that would be printed out, it'd be like 2 hours had passed, and it was just telling it about an event 2 hours ago. So like there were so many lights, so much information coming out at a delayed amount of time. They were kind of bound to fail. The men who were in charge of this particular reactor were trained on submarines, nuclear submarines, and they were always taught in their training to protect the pressurizer. If something's happened, it doesn't matter if the core melts down, you need to protect the pressurizer. And the reason for that is if you have a pressurizer go off in a nuclear submarine under the ocean, you're done. But like if the core goes off, I guess it's not that big a deal because you're dealing with so little actual material that the heat generated isn't that dangerous. You're under the ocean, there's tons of water, and it's going to cool down. It's not as big a deal as the pressurizer going off because the whole submarine's going down. So taking that training, they took that to this place, and they thought the pressurizer was like the most important thing. So they kept releasing the pressurizer, and they were supposed to have closed off the pressurizer so it could build up and put more water into the cores and the reactor cores. So when the designer of the reactor called them and said, hey, you have this thing closed off, right? And they said, yeah. And then they went and closed it off. So they're like, to save face. So the interesting thing is the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, was also a naval, he was a nuclear engineer in the Navy prior. And so he actually came to the reactor when everybody thought it was dangerous, because what happened is in part of the process, water reacting with these cores created hydrogen. The cores would strip zirconium, I don't know that it was zirconium. Yeah, zirconium would strip hydrogen from the water and then release that, and then hydrogen would build up and it would explode. And they thought that was going to happen. But it was a long debate, and in the end, their calculations were incorrect, or at least the guy who thought that the building was going to explode. And the hydrogen buildup was much smaller, and they were able to vent it. It didn't cause anything. So they did vent a bit of radioactive mist and steam, but nothing really happened. So this event sticks out in our mind because of the potential of a reactor core. You might hear like the China syndrome, but for all intents and purposes, the computer would have handled most of the stuff and then the information that they're working with was outdated. But in the end, nothing really happened here.
I think there was also some speculation that there was an increase in birth defects around that time for women who were still carrying during the incident. I don't know how true that is, or how, again, it's just kind of like got kind of lost and covered up.
I looked, and of course, you can only find what information's out there, and apparently there's not a lot of information about this, and the government, whether or not they're covering up something or not, like, they didn't find anything, and I couldn't find anything. I couldn't even really find a lot of people. There were just a few articles of people like saying that there were birth defects or problems, but there was nothing really to back that up. Chernobyl, which we're going to get into at this moment, even if, so some people were like, I was watching this video and there was people just saying the most ridiculous things that like, it's going to be 100 megaton bomb, and Minsk, which is in Belarus, like hundreds of miles away, would have felt it and noticed and all this stuff. Even if you have some of the strongest bombs we had nowadays dropped directly on Chernobyl, or that explosion right there, Minsk, hundreds of miles away, wouldn't have noticed. Yeah, they would have gotten fallout, like probably, but they wouldn't have noticed. Like maybe they'd notice like a low rumble in the distance.
A good part of that has to do with the proximity to the ground.
Yes.
I remember reading that a lot of nuclear bombs, if the purpose is destruction, they actually detonate in air over the target site, because if it actually hits the ground and goes off, the effect isn't nearly as destructive.
Exactly.
So if you had a nuclear power plant explode in like a nuclear bomb, it being on the ground, or in a lot of cases in the ground, it's not as destructive.
Exactly. And so like Hiroshima, I was watching a video about that, and it was talking about the guys like dropped the bomb, they booked it out of there as fast as they could, and it took about 45 seconds from it to leave the plane, and it detonated above the ground, and basically everybody in that town was dead. Like it was it was above the ground, but like what you're saying, if it hit the ground, you'd have more of like a crater, and the force would have been more like down and less like out or something like that. I can't remember exactly how. I'm not a physics person, but so Chernobyl, there was a whole bunch of crazy stuff that happened. But so this incident was April 26, 1986. This was after 3 Mile Island. This is Pripyat, which is outside of Chernobyl and Ukraine, and this is obviously the USSR at the time. And so the interesting is, this was 1986 when they had the problem, but 1977 was when their first reactor went online, and they actually had a core meltdown in reactor number 1 in 1982, which they didn't talk about until 85. So they repaired it, put it back online, and obviously you hear all the things about like, or at least I was told, the reason why they had a problem in Chernobyl was because they were working on these tin roofs and stuff, and like it was just really bad, which yes, they had, older technology, but the reason for it, which we're going to see right now, is they were doing things they shouldn't have been doing. So they started a test on Friday, April 25th. And basically the gist of this test was to shut the reactor off and see how much power they could get out of it while running it at lower speeds or while they were shutting it off. And what they had to do to override the computer and everything else, they had to manually unplug pumps and computer parts and things as they were running this test. And obviously once you get into like humans down there pulling plugs and things out, the computer's like freaking out and they're shutting things off manually, you're having some problems. At least I'm reading all this stuff and like, like obviously I'm not a nuclear scientist, but I've listened to and read so much stuff. I have the idea of what's going to happen when you start doing these things. Yeah. So the control rods on Saturday are transferred from local to global control. So that means like they're going to run all of them in sequence. And the power plummets in the reactor, pressure falls in the steam drums, emergency reinsertion of all control rods. And the problem with this is that the control rods didn't go all the way down. So you have all these control rods around individual rods that should have gone all the way down, but then you have the reaction still happening at the bottom where the control rods aren't. Mm-hmm. So they disconnected the clutches of the control rod servos and let them descend, but the rods didn't move. They were stuck in place.
It's important to note that the control rods themselves, the part that absorbs the neutrons that slows the reactions down and stops everything, were further up on the rod itself. The tip of it was this graphite, which I believe is what kind of can accelerate to some degree. And so when they had taken the control rods out, when they had to go back in, the graphite's the first part that enters into the system. So it spikes the whole thing. And so they haven't even gotten the part of the rod that's supposed to stop things hasn't gotten into the core, and so they stopped with the graphite stuck into the system, and that's why it started like just going up exponentially and led to where you
exactly
left off.
And so you have this initial explosion, and this was a steam explosion, and you also have right after that an immediate another sparking explosion from the graphite because it's so flammable, exploding as well. And apparently a lot of people said it was very beautiful flames coming up, but deadly flames. They didn't realize radiation was being dropped on them.
Well, it was ionizing the air. I mean, causing this really creepy glow. It was kind of crazy. I mean, I don't know. This whole, this is pretty crazy stuff.
So that was Saturday. Nothing, like over the weekend, they're obviously trying to contain this. They're like preparing to like get people out of there. And then come Monday, the rest of the world starts figuring out, ooh, hey, something's going on. Sweden. Somebody comes in, he had shoes on that were radioactive apparently on the soles. So they start testing and they find out, hey, something's going on. And then the Moscow TV announces that they had an accident.
A lot of the video footage is all grainy because of just the bombardment of radiation is just kind of distorting the film and causing this graininess.
So like crazy. I was watching some of the things of other people who were there in Pripyat, and they had all these buses come in. They were waiting there like the night before, the next day. They're like, okay, everybody get on the buses. But there was a lot of confusion, and some of the people were saying like, I saw these kids like sitting and playing in the sand and just like waiting for the buses, and they didn't realize that there was fallout. That's the problem, is like with fallout that gets into the air from a nuclear bomb or a reactor or something, you have all this dust that settles, and then all that stuff's contaminated, and you have to strip off that first layer of soil to make it decontaminated. You have to get rid of that stuff. This thing is still producing radiation, and they built a sarcophagus. They came up with this idea to build a giant concrete sarcophagus to slow it all, and it was only to last 30 years. Like, this sarcophagus was not a permanent solution. But prior to them building the sarcophagus, they go and restart reactor number 1 in September and starts producing power. They can resume construction on reactors 5 and 6, some new ones, and then they restart reactor number 2 in November. And then December, they finalize the sarcophagus, this big concrete dome over big concrete structure over this thing. All along, like, I had been thinking that, oh, hey, they had this explosion at Chernobyl, and then it was just over, like, that was it. But no, they were like running power plant. They were still producing power there for like a good long, like a couple decades, I think it was. And December 15th of the year 2000 is the last functioning reactor, and they shut it down. I have a video here. Yeah, there's like a video you can go online. I will link it in the description. There's some guys meeting, and they like just talk about like, hey, we're going to give the order and we're going to shut down the thing. And it must have been like a sad day for them, because it was like a huge part of their lives to be like running this thing. And then the most recent thing on that is in 2015, they built 2 halves of this new safe containment or new safe confinement, a giant metal structure that a bunch of countries worked on together. And they moved this, and it's pretty crazy to watch it. And I have a video of it. Like, they moved this giant building over the reactor site and sealed it up. And that's supposed to last, I think, a good 100 years or something. It's still not like a permanent solution. It's kind of where we're at today. They've turned the area into, they're building solar power plants now. They put the shield up. Now they're doing solar plants and solar power plants. And you can see that there are like people who live in that area, and there's still effects of radiation, cancer, and other things throughout Europe from this. Because if you look at some of the mapping data on where all this spread, it spread out quite a swath of Europe. Whew, I feel like I've been talking a lot. That's a good, like 30 minutes of just like 2 reactors. So I'm going to just skip through Fukushima Daiichi, because I know you have a lot to say about new Gen 4 stuff. But the gist of what happened in Daiichi was similar to the Chernobyl incident as far as an explosion from a buildup. But this one was with hydrogen. And obviously we have in Friday, March 11th, we have an earthquake, we have a tsunami. It comes in, knocks off a bunch of their generators that cool the reactors. They evacuate people within 2 miles of the plant, and then they start venting off steam over the next few days. And reactor 1, its cores are exposed completely. They melt. And this is just a bunch of like disparate information as far as what happened here. The older workers tell the younger ones to leave because like they're at the end of their lives and they know that there's going to be fallout from this. On March 12th, the emergency battery backup for reactor 3 runs out. Fuel rods are exposed, steam released into the air, and this is obviously a bit radioactive steam. And they extend their evacuation zone. Reactor 1 has an explosion from hydrogen buildup because the cores, again, like zirconium splits hydrogen from water molecules, and the cores had melted and fallen to the bottom. They're like dumping water in here, and they didn't realize there was a buildup of hydrogen. And they had this happen like 3 times. Reactor 1, 3, and 4. No, 2 as well, I believe, blows up because there was damage from one of the other ones. So anyways, you have a bunch of like explosions here, and in the end, they were able to evacuate most of that area. They contained the zone, and what's happening right now is you have annual protests against nuclear energy because they still use it in Japan. And they have this exclusion zone, but they're slowly like shrinking the exclusion zone as they're stripping off the soil and containing the groundwater that gets contaminated by going through this area. And they have all these giant metal containers that they keep putting the water in. but they're like cleaning it. And now there's some disagreement about, so they have this advanced liquid processing system where they're trying to release this, they want to release this treated water that's been processed. It's millions of gallons of water. They say there's only tritium in it, which they say isn't harmful because it's already in water. It's in your body. It's not harmful. But some people disagree and say there are other particles in it. So the government there in Japan is thinking about just dumping it in the ocean, which personally, like, I'm okay with because I think the ocean will flush it out, and I don't think it's going to be that dangerous in the long run. But some people think that the water is still contaminated and it isn't treated the way they say it is.
Okay, yeah. So Generation 3 reactors, it's bad that they get that nuclear power in general gets this kind of this leaves a bad taste in people's mouths, and there's a lot of stuff against them because, and it's usually for like safety reasons, right? But it's somewhat ironic that in not advancing nuclear reactor innovation and design, you're actually missing out on what could be far more safer iterations of some of these reactors. And so what we have now is a Generation 4 reactor, which is kind of this, it kind of describes several different types of reactor designs that have been coming out over the past couple of decades. And they've learned a ton from a lot of the previous nuclear disasters and have kind of built things into their designs to better handle different things. So one of the hallmarks has been automatic or passive shutdowns of some of these reactors, so that in the event of a catastrophic failure, things still can revert down to a safe or inert type state. And they've also been kind of improving on the fuel efficiency and just kind of the byproducts and that kind of stuff. And so it's been pretty interesting. Kind of learning a little bit more about them. The Department of Energy has been kind of funding or incentivizing new designs. I think in 2030 they're looking to come out with some actual more fleshed out prototypes of some of these reactor designs, which is pretty exciting. So and some of the other reason why a lot of this private industry that kind of tries to do these reactors, there's a lot of regulation surrounding getting a design of a new reactor design to get to pass certification. It's a very long, drawn out process, and they're not going to wait that long. So it does take some kind of peeling back some regulation for the Department of Energy to kind of let these things go through, but they are making those kind of strides. So Generation 4 reactors kind of encompass a couple different major categories. I'm only going to name about 3 of them and then focus on one of them. So the 3 kind of major ones that I saw were a sodium-cooled fast reactor, one called a very high temperature reactor, and as you know, the higher the temperature, the more fuel efficient you can get. There's efficiencies gained at very high temperatures, but when you're dealing with water, it gets really unstable and very chaotic at high temperatures, and so that's why they use like metal to cool, like lead cooled or steel cooled, which sounds really bad, but I mean, when you're talking about temperatures this high, molten lead is actually cooler than some of this other stuff. So but it's good that if you can operate at those higher temperatures, and you can squeeze out far better efficiencies from the fuel, so you're kind of making a better use of what you already have. The last one I want to talk more about is the molten salt reactor. So this is molten salt that does the cooling. And so just to give you an idea, so with the fuel efficiencies that are gained from this, and this is not an exaggeration, they range from 100 to 300 times more efficient at extracting just straight heat from these fuel rods than compared to previous generations. Some of these reactor designs will actually feed off of, or they're fueled by the waste from Generation 3 or before. They'll take that nuclear waste and they'll reprocess it to extract even more energy out of it. And the byproduct from that is something that has a half-life of hundreds of years instead of thousands of years. So previous generations of reactors produce this nuclear waste that's radioactive for thousands of years. They just seal it up in steel drums and throw it into a salt mine and kind of forget about it and hope, to bring that half-life down. And when I say half-life, it means, it's something that remains unstable. It's gonna slowly revert down to a stable isotope. And so when it does that, it becomes sort of inert or just not nearly as dangerous. And so that's what we're talking about half-life. So if you have something that's dangerous for thousands of years, or you can have something that's only dangerous for maybe hundreds of years. So it's kind of lesser of two evils, but it's a lot easier to kind of manage at that point. So the molten salt reactors, I'm just going to kind of, I'm going to switch over to show you just a brief look at the Generation 3 reactors that Chad had talked about. So here we have, this is a look inside of a Generation 3 reactor core. This is where the fuel rods, or not the fuel rods, the control rods have been completely removed. And so you're looking into this reactor core. It's completely filled with water. It tends to be heavy water, which is really expensive. Sometimes you get light water. It's a little easier to deal with. But this entire chamber is filled with that water, and that blue glow is the Cherenkov radiation, as the radiation coming from the fuel rods is reacting through the medium that's the water. And so you get this blue glow. It's kind of cool looking. If you watch videos of it, it's fascinating. But the water is pumped in and out of this chamber. So the heated water is pumped out from the top because heat rises, displacing the cold water, and the cooler water is at the bottom. It's being pumped in. And so that's how they kind of cycle the water through, because they want the hot water to come out, which they can turn into steam. And they have to pressurize it because they don't want steam in the reactor. Pressurization causes problems too. It makes it more dangerous. There's one more thing to go wrong. So here's just a quick little diagram of a Generation 3 reactor. And you can kind of see that what we were looking at in the previous picture, this was the actual reactor core, where all the water is in there and pressurized. The water pumps in the colder water. It comes through, it gets heated up, and it comes back through. And there's a heat exchange that happens where there's regular just water that's pumped into the same heat exchange chamber. And it takes on, it being much colder, it takes all the heat off of the water being pumped through it. It turns into steam and gets pushed through turbines, which of course generates electricity. It condenses and gets thrown into the into the cooling towers, and you get all that water vapor coming out the top. And all the colder water kind of drains the bottom, where it's repumped back into the heat exchange to bring more heat back up to the turbines. So this last picture here is this is the Generation 4 molten salt reactor. I think this is more of a kind of not a dumbed down thing, but it doesn't show you like all the different craziness that goes on to these things. But just a couple things to note. So this is where they have purified salt that comes into the reactor core, and they still control the reaction with control rods, as you can see. But all the salt comes in, and it takes on all the heat. So they can bring these fuel rods. They can bring the reactions up to much higher temps, and because the salt can carry way more heat. And so this is where the efficiency comes in. So that salt then goes in through the first heat exchanger, where there's another set of molten salt that runs across it and carries the heat from the salt that's cycling through the core, and it brings it to a second heat exchanger where we have the water that comes in, turns the steam, turns the turbine, and all that kind of stuff. And then it just kind of pumps through. So one of the hallmarks of these Generation 4 reactors, I said before, the automatic or passive shutdowns, if you see at the bottom of the reactor here, where the fuel salt is, it has to go through as a processing plant that purifies it later. But if you see at the bottom, there's a freeze plug and then dump tanks. So the way this works, all the molten salt in the reactor is what gets like highly irradiated from all this stuff, and so it's actually acting on this freeze plug and trying to, of course, thaw it out very quickly. But the plant itself has to actively freeze the plug to keep everything running. If there's a complete shutdown, the freeze plug obviously thaws, and then the entire reactor is evacuated of its molten salt down into these emergency dump tanks, which are lined and have different components that absorb the neutrons and completely stop the reactions there. And the control rods can be safely inserted to stop any reactions there. So this is what makes it to where if there's a failure, it can fail very elegantly and safely. And so that's one of the big hallmarks of these new Generation 4 reactors. That being aside, they don't have to pressurize the water or whatever medium, the coolant rather, through the core. They don't have to pressurize that, so they don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. And then just being able to operate at much higher temperatures if they're running a sodium, which is technically a metal, a molten sodium across things, or there's molten salt or lead or steel. When they're trying to run those things through, they can operate at far higher temperatures, so they can extract a much higher efficiency from the system. So yeah, that's one of the big things there. And I already talked about some of the just the being able to use the waste from previous generations of reactors. This also, there's another, I just going to talk a little briefly about it. Another one that's kind of come up in terms of Generation 4 called a lifter reactor, LFTR, or liquid fluoride thorium reactor, which uses thorium as the fuel sources. It still uses molten salt, so it's kind of related to do the cooling. The good thing about thorium is it's a lot safer to kind of handle. The U.S. has a massive stockpile of it. They can when they fission the thorium, I believe that they somehow get uranium out of it, and they can continue to use that. And so this makes the what they call the fuel cycle of nuclear reactors a little better. And when I talk about the fuel cycle, it's the extracting the uranium from the ground, enriching it. There's a lot that goes into doing that can be also dangerous, just to get to the part where they're actually burning or fissioning the fuel, and then they have to worry about how they're going to dispose of the waste. And so these molten salt reactors, or Generation 4 reactors just in general, they can take their fuel cycles are a lot easier. So they can be fed some of this other stuff, like thorium, and then they can just sit there and churn through their own stuff for years and years and years without having to be having the fuel replaced. And then what they produce is not that bad, relatively. So just to give you an idea, another thing is that current gen reactors tend to have an 18-month fuel cycle. So when they put the fuel rods in, they have about 18 months of constant running before those rods are spent, and they got to cycle them out with new ones. With the Generation 4, they can put in the first iteration of fuel lasts about 30 years, which most likely would be the lifetime of the plant itself. So I saw this video of this gentleman named Taylor Wilson. This is a little bit a while ago. He was still in high school. He's a prodigy. He has a passion for designing nuclear reactors, and he's quite good at it, even at a very young age. And so he's designed several of these Generation 4 reactors. It's pretty cool. And one of the designs that he came up with, I didn't find out how that all went. But his goal was and he showed a little picture of it, but a self-contained nuclear reactor that could be mass-produced and then shipped around. And what you would do is you would basically bury this thing like hundreds of feet into the ground, give it a fuel source, and then put a building over it, and like an outbuilding just to kind of feed it water and things like that. And this thing just runs for like 30 years, and then when it's done, you just seal it up, and that's it. Because it'll go through its fuel, it then goes through its waste, and then finally just, its efficiency drops down to where it's barely producing anything. And at that point, you're like, well, just leave it in the ground. It's self-contained. And then you just kind of move on to the next one. And so that was kind of cool because it's kind of built-in safety. If it were to fail, it's hundreds of feet underground. It's already self-contained, and that's the end of it. And of course, it's got the dump tanks and that kind of stuff. So when it does fail, it fails elegantly, and then you just leave it in the ground, and then you pick it up in a couple hundred years or however long it takes, and you can excavate it later and dispose of it properly. But it's really interesting designs. I think it required economies of scale to be economically feasible, right? So it probably would cost too much, and that may be why I haven't heard anything since, is because he probably couldn't get it to a point where to mass produce it and turn a profit. No one's really going to do that. But it was just kind of interesting where some of these things are going. So I've been pretty impressed with how this Generation 4 reactor stuff is heading. It's pretty exciting stuff. It's a huge improvement over current gen stuff, which is why I said it's very unfortunate that Generation 3 gets this really this bad rap about it, when really, if we would just kind of look honestly at nuclear power as being far more viable. And what's ridiculous is that even today we're not really focusing on nuclear, and we're allowing fossil fuel stuff and coal generation But that kills a lot more people. There's a lot of more problems. It's not analyzed as much, but it kills way more. Like if you add up all the nuclear disasters, it doesn't even come close to what, coal and other stuff that we're continuing to burn and throw stuff into the air. It doesn't even come close to the deaths that those have caused. So it's a very, very odd subject how people have taken it. And I don't want to, just sounds like it's all marketing, it's all marketing. They just,
well,
so
it might be.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of, it's really interesting when you get to like, you use the word marketing, their like public perception of stuff is shaped.
Oh, yeah.
Greatly by like, how people watch a movie and then they'll think something is true.
Yeah.
And when it really isn't, which they're all quick to harp on, what was it, The Greatest Showman, and like how that guy really wasn't that great of a guy or whatever.
Yeah.
But when you go to see like HBO series Chernobyl or other things like that, there are just ridiculous unscientific claims in there. And that I was looking at and researched this. And just like with that correlation between nuclear bombs, and just because the word nuclear there doesn't mean that they do the same thing. They're completely different.
Right.
Like they're the same materials in the name, but like what's going on and how it's working is not the same at all. So it is sad because like what you're saying, it is very true. We're spending all this money to do air power and solar power, and then just continuing to rely on fossil fuels, because when it comes down to it, like generating electricity is the big thing, because obviously our vehicles right now produce and rely so much on fossil fuels. And if we move those to electric, we still have the same problem that we have to generate the electricity to power their batteries, which is still primarily fossil fuels. And not that I'm not like a Greenpeace, nature-based kind of person. Like, say no to the ozone. Like, I'm not like either way on it. But I and as far as global warming and all that kind of stuff, I think there are some precedences for some things to be said there. But if you're looking at it from either perspective, it makes 100% more sense to move into nuclear energy completely, because you eliminate all of those issues. Particularly one thing that was recently, like you may have heard about this, all that waste you were talking about, that we bury it. Basically, we just stick it in the ground in the can and just hide it away.
They're in salt mines
Bill
in
Gates
Utah.
Came up.
That's where they put them all. Well, not just Utah, but they're in salt mines across the Midwest or parts of the West.
Yeah, and we were like, oh, well, just hide this and put it away. Well, Bill Gates has a power plant that he was working on until recently. I think the Trump administration kind of like halted some of his stuff. He was working with TerraPower out of China, and other countries are making much more progress in nuclear energy than we are at this point, because they understand like, well, we need to move that direction, and public perception here hinders it. But recently, I think it was just a few weeks ago, the Department of Energy of the U.S. awarded $160 million to X Energy and TerraPower to work on these new, and you were mentioning smaller scale, flexible, advanced nuclear reactor designs. And they're supposed to be coming out with these things. And Bill Gates, part of this was they were working on using the waste material, uranium-236, I believe it was. Yeah, because so your difference is your highly enriched uranium is like 238, and in the process it loses 2 of its neutrons, so it goes down to 236, and we can't use it in those reactors. But these reactors can. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that way.
Yeah, and there's also some competing funding too. I know we have ITER. ITER, which I don't remember what the acronym means, but basically nuclear fusion is another thing too. We have tokamak reactors. Those designs super complex, but they're trying to prototype those. And while fusion is fusion is always 10 years away. It's been that way for I don't know how many decades, but it's always just around the corner. I don't want to be too disparaging on it, because it is a very promising idea. But I mean, like, we could have Gen 4 stuff in a much shorter time frame, and instead of just like constantly waiting for fusion to kind of come around. So I think Generation 4 is probably a little better way to go, at least in the short term. Yeah,
definitely. And like, I think there are some. So when you're digging around with like anything, once you start going into like nuclear reactors, you quickly get into like nuclear bombs and conspiracy stuff. Yeah. And with this, but I was very surprised with nuclear reactors in particular. There's a lot of conspiracy. I don't know if it's conspiracy, but just they say there are people who say that the government has its hands. The Department of Energy, or they call them the Energy Cartel, has their hands in this pie. Like, they are really doing things, I don't know about hindering, but they just don't want people to have ways to produce energy on their own because they want to run the power grid. And that some of the elements that we're dealing with aren't that dangerous. So like one in particular is radon, that the EPA says like you have limits of gamma radiation is bad and dangerous and all this stuff. So there's a name, I think I sent you the video, but there's this guy named Galen Windsor. He's dead. He just passed away like in the early 2000s from old age or something, Parkinson's or something like that. But he was doing all these videos, and I'll link in the description, where he's talking for a very long time, and I don't understand everything that he's saying because it's way above my head. But he was just saying like how some of this is ridiculous, that in his power plants, he was an engineer who worked in these plants years ago, decades ago, and they would he'd take plutonium or whatever, uranium, different cores, and just separate the two parts so they don't become critical, and put them in his two different pockets and walk down the hallway. And he was like on this video like eating bits of radon producing uranium, and he's just like, whatever, like I've been doing this for months and years and it's not a big deal. Like you go like swim in the radiation or in the pools where they like store the old reactor cores and stuff like that. Yeah. And he's saying that the government has its hands in telling the public that they're to be afraid of things that aren't necessarily to be feared. Like there are aspects of it that are definitely dangerous, and like you have Madame Curie or the radium girls, and you're dealing specifically with like parts of radiated materials can be very dangerous. But in particular, like he was advocating for smaller, like localized or individual household reactors, like what you were talking about. And this was decades ago that he was like talking about this. Especially going back to the radon thing is one thing that like I think is stupid personally about the radon thing. Once you try to look into like, oh, hey, how many people a year die by radon poisoning and stuff, it gets really murky about whether or not like how they figure that information, and there's just like broad sweeping statements and numbers out there. And my like I was looking into it because we had radon in one of our houses when we went to sell it, and when you look into like how radon reacts in air, like if it rises or falls, the systems that they designed for it don't make any sense with the physics of the material itself. And one thing that the guy was talking about, Galen, he had a bottle, and he said of radioactive material, and he said the interesting thing about this is it when it interacts with air, it creates radon, or radon is like a daughter of this uranium material that he had. And then once it interacts with, I can't remember what particular particles in air, it becomes helium is the next like byproduct or something like that. And like basically it falls out and it's fine after that. Like that radon is not that dangerous. And you come across all these articles from like old newspapers from the 80s and 90s of people like going out to, I think it was Oregon or Montana, to these mines where people go to intentionally expose themselves to high levels of radon in the air for curing regenerative diseases and stuff like that. So I don't know, like this is where the conspiracy stuff is, because there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make any sense. Yeah. It does seem like we should be a lot further along with some of these technologies, and I don't know. I don't really know where to like stand on the whole issue, but I definitely think there could be a lot more progress to be made. It seems a bit weird.
Yeah, I think money has to do a lot with it. I mean, if you're currently if your portfolio is composed of a lot of energy futures or different things like that, I mean, you're just kind of like, I don't know, like you don't really want something to come in and upset that. Or if you do allow it, then you want to get your cut. So if you're like an influential regulator, you know, maybe you would like some kind of kickback or something, you know, like they're trying to find a way to make money off of it. You're not going to make a big switch in energy production without, you know, getting your cut. And so there might be a lot of that kind of stuff. It might just come down to ignorance, and there's politics. You know, no one wants to be seen as the person who allowed a whole new generation of nuclear reactors to come online. I don't know. It could be a myriad of things. It's just, you know, human nature, once again, gets in our way. But, you know, I don't know what to say.
Yeah. And it's really hard because, like, just like with the oil rig, Deepwater Horizon that we were talking about last time, or with any of these situations, and maybe we'll talk about Argus at some point. It was one name that I came across a lot. You get into any of these situations, and you only have so much information that is presented to us. For some reason, every government, obviously, you want to protect certain trade secrets, government secrets, certain things that are going on. It doesn't help public perception at all to be secretive about things.
Yeah.
And they still do it. And I understand there's like some things you do have to be secret on because of like dangerous consequences and certain things like sensitive information. But at the same time, it's kind of like shooting yourself in the foot and trying to walk. It doesn't help. So I don't know. I don't think there's any like right answer to handling the issue, because if there's better things to be had in the nuclear department and they're holding back on some of those things, like it's going to be hurting you to like not be forthcoming with what exactly is going on behind the scenes and why the decisions are being made. But I would assume, just like with our election, there are something about money and there are politics involved that we are unaware of.
Well, what was that show Mythbusters, where they were going to do an episode on credit card fraud and basically show how easy it is to actually pull off, and they got, I mean, I don't know, they were very dodgy. I think when they interviewed the hosts later at some point, somehow that came up and they mentioned, they're like, oh, what about that? And it's like, well, we actually cannot talk about that at all. All they know is that they taped an episode where they showed how easy it was to do credit card fraud, and I'm guessing someone pulled some strings and got that cut real quick, and so they're not allowed to talk about it. And then some of the discussion around that had ended up being that it's actually very easy and happens a lot, and so the credit card companies have invested a lot of money to where they're looking at things behind the scenes. Algorithms are looking for behavioral patterns, purchasing patterns. And they figure out like, oh yeah, you're a lot of times your credit card has been compromised for a while, and they just deal with it. Usually, and then if it becomes too much, they reissue a new card. So like once in a while, you get that message like, hey, we're sending you a new card, that kind of thing. It's because of stuff like that. So it's kind of crazy. So I believe it. I mean, it's a semi-old system. It hasn't been updated much, and I don't know, but yeah, it's stuff like that. It makes it difficult sometimes to find reliable information. So,
we'll have to see what we're going to talk about next time. I know that we need to get around to the Epstein thing at some point.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Oh boy, that's a dangerous place to be, I think.
It is. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, yeah.
Which I'm okay with, like, talking about, like, even with this thing, my wife was saying, like, are you going to get hauled away? Like, are we going to not see you? Like, Men in Black are going to show up, and which apparently happens because I've talked to other people that have friends who, like, have had people in black coats and ties show up and say, hey, stop looking into this or else.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's a bit scary, and I don't know. I guess this is where we'll sign off on the show. But first off, we have a Patreon link in the description. If you want to invest in our show, it gives us time. First off, like if we got income from the show, we put it right back into it. Helps us get better equipment, better video cameras that don't shut off in the middle of the recording, and gives us money to have time to do this outside of our day jobs, to actually invest in research or fly ourselves down to some island to find out what perpetrators have done wrong. Which suddenly we get us.
That could be your project.
Yeah, we get an influx of income. Yeah, fly yourselves down there, see what happened. Can't believe we committed to that. But so if you want to support the show, there's that. I'd like to get some merch out with our logos and stuff on it. Hopefully I'll get a link in the description on all these videos at some point. If you want to check out our podcast, I'll put links in the description for my Chattervast podcast, where I just talk about things that I'm interested in, and Ryan's podcast, Ready Rhino 1. Is that what you're calling it now? Ready Rhino 1?
Yes.
Okay. You have playthroughs on games, discussions about various things that you do and are interested in, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I like the woodworking one. That was fun.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I guess we'll sign off here, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Comment, please. If you have something you want us to check out, please comment it below. We'd love to be invested with our community. And if you're on podcasting, please give us a 5-star review. We really appreciate, and all those things help all the algorithms as we move forward. And I hope you enjoyed Escape News. And again, I was your host, Chad, and
this is Ryan.
Yep. Signing off. We'll see you guys later.
All right. See ya.